Hey everybody, this is Petey from the Spinner Rack, and we also have
Calvin Ellis ready to rock.
today. We wanted to talk about our initial feelings of Image Comics when they came up. But I just want to give you before we get into it, I just want to give you the comic, what was going on in comics in kind of the late '80s and '90s. This is gonna be really quick, just going through some of the articles in the Comics Buyer's Guide, where you can see they were already talking about Marvel's high output. Does it help or hurt comic books? Right? So,
Well, we definitely know the answer to that now. That that question has been answered.
what is the answer?
The answer is yes. Yes, it hurts it.
Okay, so we got that established, but Marvel always once the clamps was off after DC was able to release the clamps, they published like No Tomorrow, but then at the same time, the '70s was a struggle for a lot of for comics, a lot of people getting out. So seeing that in the '80s now they're back in the swing of things and producing a ton of comic books. So as we go along, we also hear in '84 Marvel having a price hike. So they're taking, they're bringing the price up 5 cents more. So you start to see that, and then you'll see things start to change in comics at the same time. It's responding, respond. And, slowly. So I just want to point out here, they had before John Burton's Superman came out. We know that was a big seller for them, but this is the point, probably the last time we heard that Superman drew mail and also had a phone response. So people were calling and writing in, and this used in the past that used to be the sign that you had success going on because you had like the Legion of Superheroes. People wrote in about that, probably Bizarro. Anything they were doing like one issue in the past, they'd be like, "Oh wow, people like that. Let's do that again." So that's kind of thing. Whereas I think the Bizarro was, he died at the end of that one. So it's like when they hear that, it's like, "Oh, let's do some more." So this is the last time you kind of hear the people writing in and calling in actually. So then we go in there. '87 is coming along, and DC is talking about 30 more titles. and as we go on, we have the the X-Men crossovers, which was, of course, the big hit was the Mutant Massacre, and then you had Fall of the Mutants, and this we just noted is saying here is Inferno. I'm just going to be a little bit out of order, but it'll be the late '80s, and then you also had the larger books, which were the Masterworks, that give you all the old comic books. But what about the independent market, right? The black and whites, I didn't. I actually was surprised that this page came up at the same time. The implosion of the black and white comic books, whereas the Turtles was big and everyone followed suit. We have an implosion of all those independent comic books. So it's starting. We got a lot of stuff happening in Marvel and DC, and we have the black and white implosion. Did outside of the Turtles, or any other black and white books that you checked out? One
Mm,
right there. If you don't remember, there's one right on the page. What's that?
no, I didn't read that.
You didn't read that? Okay. Um,
Unless you were, are you talking about Lone Wolf and Cub?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's, I mean, it's manga, so it's all black and white. I've never seen anything color in manga, so yeah. But I think I'm trying to remember if Cerebus was
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Service is still going, I think.
yeah, Cerebus was black and white. It was that. No, that wouldn't count. Those books definitely wouldn't count. We can't talk about those books. X-rated. But
Um, well,
no, actually, what was the do you remember it was the publication year? Like uh yeah, because it was on Kitchen Sink Press. Cherry Pop Tart. Do you remember like what was the publication year of that? Was
I
that
don't
like
know
late
the.
80s?
Yeah, that was mid '80s, wasn't it? No, well, actually, it was also published in the '80s because I had a cover of the swimsuit issue of the Amazing Heroes, and I think that character was on the cover, uh, and a little more clothes than normal. So yeah, I mean, anything that's independent, we can throw that in there. But it was a big boom for independence.
Yeah. I didn't buy Cherry Pop Tart, but it was something that I would read on the stands when I went over. When I went over, I was like, I'm not paying for this, but I will, let's spend a little time reading this. Okay, great. Nobody's looking? Okay, great. Let me just put it right back. Then go, I'll spend my money on something in color. But yeah, those are the things I can remember black and white.
So they
But
had the black and white, the aardvarks, they had all the offshoots of the turtles that were going on, all these things that were kind of just jumping into it. So you can say maybe these weren't the best projects, but at the same time, you see Lone Wolf and Cub is at third printing, so you had something at least independent that was doing well. And the Turtles was fine, and you'll see some of the Turtles, but at the same time, Batman, which was trying to struggle to find its way, they kill off Robin with a phone thing to get money off the phone, and the sales for the death of Robin of Jason Todd were big for them. So you see, and then this was the crazy thing that I didn't know that Arkham Asylum.
well, that's the Donald Duck effect. No, not sorry, not Donald. That's the. Do you remember that Looney Tunes with
What?
Daffy Duck and
Oh,
Bugs Bunny?
Daffy Duck. Yes, yes, yes. It's
You
mine,
know,
mine, all mine.
everybody loves Bugs. They hate Daffy, and Daffy's like, no, I got something that's gonna. It's a showstopper.
Oh, okay. Yo,
And
that.
he like he
Yes.
blows himself up, and the audience is like, yeah, yeah. He's like, yeah, but I can only do it once. You can only kill Robin once. So that's where they were at with that.
Yeah. So yeah, so you have Arkham Asylum, which was a big seller. I would like to say that Grant Morrison has kind of disowned this book because he somehow found the super folks, and he was like, I didn't have to do a crappy Batman after all. But anyway, we see that the Batman has these hot titles that are selling out. There's going to be even bigger year. These titles they're talking about. Sam Hamm writing the detective. He was doing a Batman movie. The Batman craze hit, and that was crazy. So it's like DC. We look at the mutant books and Spider-Man with Todd McFarlane, but DC had Batman going. They'd already earlier had Superman with the Man of Steel series selling well initially. The big thing, and then it went to more than what it was initially, but the crazy sales was going on in '89 for Batman at this period. And then Marvel is raising their prices. Now, this is the thing that I didn't know about. So I know we're
I'm
talking
gonna
about.
want to interject real quick because I was there in real time for the Batman craze. You could have drawn a bat on a piece of paper. It was just it was wild. I didn't and I this was real time because I remember asking someone, look, when the Superman movie came out, was it like this? He's like, oh yeah, some more books sold, but it was nothing like this. It really was a craze. That should have been a precursor of things to come. But even to this day, I still don't understand why, it was such a craze at the end of the day. But I guess because, I don't know, it's not something you would think about with Superman, where it's like, okay, we have super cake, super drink, super this, but literally it was bat this, bat that.
You
They
could
never looked
club.
back from the whole thing.
You could club in a Batman shirt. You could go to a club with the Batman insignia from the movie and you're in the dancing pants and whatnot, and you would be in the house. It was a crazy period. But this is just to say it wasn't just Marvel, but at the same time, Marvel did the sneaky thing where they said, you know what, we are, there's a thing with books that didn't sell, they go right to the direct market to see if they could survive. Marvel, on the other hand, they decided to raise all their top selling books. So when I look at it, there was books that I was buying, I didn't realize X-Men costs 25 cents more, Amazing Spider-Man, and I was just like, they're gouging us. And I didn't even pay attention to it. So they raised the price. They still had regular price on, I think, like Fantastic Four. And then they're introducing new series like Wolverine, the Submariner one, but we're going to get to the Punisher. The Punisher was getting a second title. They already had one title that was going crazy. Then they had the summer. The summer, they talk about the Evolutionary War. They had the summer crossovers, which were big. So it's like there's almost now. See, we have a little. No, that's actually not. That's not. V for Vendetta isn't actually an independent book. It's brought out by DC. But then we see, Superman titles were the last titles at some of the more than just Superman, but Superman and some Batman titles were still at 75 cents, where Marvel would already put most of the book up. They're trying to hold the line as best they can. They know that they're selling stuff like crazy, but at the same time they're trying to say, hey, we're not going to go on all these regular books. But they had Baxter books that were $1.50. Then they're doing a new Batman title, and at the same time, independents are being squeezed. Success with the big two leave, little for the others, right? And we have a name, Dave Elbrick, who's actually he would become the publisher for Image comic books, but he is feeling the struggle too. So it's like right here in black and white, we see this happening. Wolverine #1, Punisher, they're out of stock. Batman, let's see, Batman 50, sorry, Superman 50 is selling out. Batman for 457, that's selling out. And then you have Jim Lee's Extinction Agenda. Spider-Man #1 is coming. So it's like, I'm saying it's important that Image happened because and I didn't know this going in there. I'm just buying comic books. I'm not thinking about the market or independent market at all. I bought a couple of the Titans, 10 Ninja Turtles, but I wasn't in the know to know any of this. But it's interesting to see how much is selling and selling out. Another Batman title. The Fantastic Four is hooking up with Arthur Adams to get a hot thing. Lobo is selling out. So they have all this stuff happening. Ghost Rider is selling out too. The Turtles doing well. Millennium was going crazy. So you have all this. Robin was now even a big seller. Robin was big enough seller. They had his second series was big sales too. And then X-Men #1 is the benchmark of the biggest thing out there. I think I got it. It's going to be mixed up after this. There's Robin 2 having the various. Then Image hits. So the Image guys obviously came from Marvel. They came from some of the hottest titles. We have Jim Lee on X-Men, Rob Liefeld on X-Force, Whilce Portacio on on X Factor, but he was on other X-Men title. He actually had a delayed time to get to Image, but he was announced at the same time. He became a partner, and then he kind of gave up partner status a little while after that. Todd McFarlane doing Spider-Man, Marc Silvestri had done X-Men and Wolverine, and Jim Valentino was doing the Guardians of the Galaxy, but he also had done a ton of stuff with Rob Liefeld. And then you also had Erik Larsen, who was doing Spider-Man. He did the Todd Spider-Man title, and they had formed a coup. I guess they really weren't planning on actually leaving Marvel. They all were kind of trying to keep one toe in, one toe out, but Todd was kind of like, we're stepping out of Marvel and like almost like a union sort of thing and breaking out and doing their own thing, and he really wanted to stick it to Marvel, and he told that stuff to their face. And they same with DC, even though Jim Lee and Rob were kind of thinking about doing maybe a DC title. Jim Lee was thinking about doing Shadow of the Batman title, but he wanted to do the covers, and they said, no, you can't do the covers. We already got covers, painted covers. So he's like, nope, I'm not doing it. And he went all in on Image too. So with all that said, I gave everyone the problem that we did definitely need Image. We need someone to make independent comics, bring some light to independent comics. And they did that. So what were your first thoughts of Image? I got through all my big, long thing. What were your thoughts?
Well, just for the common collector at the time, I wasn't aware of any of this stuff going on. And the Image guys, Larsen, McFarlane, Jim Lee, Silvestri, these guys worked on books that I didn't read. I didn't buy. So I got off Spider-Man right before McFarlane got on Spider-Man. I was not an X-Men reader, so I didn't read X-Force. I didn't read X-Men or any of the related titles. So these guys were hot on books that I wasn't reading. I was reading The Incredible Hulk. Todd McFarlane had he had a run on Incredible Hulk, which I thought was cool. But by the time these guys were coming off, it was Spider-Man that was, it was Spider-Man that was the major book. And what was a big deal when it came out with Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man got a new series. That was a very big deal, But even then, I wasn't reading it. I didn't buy any copies or anything of that nature. And they were already trying to exploit, which would become standard with we got the new #1, we got 5 different covers, we got the gold, you got this. Same thing they had done with X-Men #1. So they were already exploiting those type of marketing strategies when it came to the comics, but I was reading and buying what I liked. And these were not, I was, never an X-Men reader. I like Spidey, but I wasn't really feeling the direction that he was in at that point. So when these guys blew up, I got the ripples, but most guys were like there, ground zeros, getting the effect. Okay, So when they form Image, I'm like, okay, Image Comics, this new thing, and I'm pretty much just getting the ripple effect. I don't realize how big Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, I don't know how big these guys are.
Hmm.
I have no idea. So, you know, I take a look at Image Comics, but the buzz that I was getting is this is the second coming of Marvel Comics. This is it. This is like 1961 all over again. You want to be there. You want to be there ground one. I mean, you want to be there from day one. You want to be there from the ground up. Now, while that was the buzz, I was still like, okay, I'll check this out, but I'm pretty much going to buy the books that I like. I'm not just buying this to check it out for these books. Even then, I was kind of like, I don't know, buddy. So I dismissed just about every Image book, at first glance. Savage Dragon, I was like, that looks like the Hulk trying to be a cop. I didn't even realize the Savage Dragon was that short because they were like, he's 6'5", counting the fin. I was like, I don't know what the heck that means. So that was done. Not X Force, but Wildcats, Youngblood. I was like, this looks like, X-Men slash Teen Titans. If I want to read these books, I'll read the original. The only one that I caught on to long term was Spawn. And again, I didn't buy the first issue of Spawn. Second, it was issue number 5 with the introduction of a character called Billy Kincaid, in which I thought was a really, for that time, a really hard hitting story. And that guys were actually talking about. So I said, let me pick up this issue and see what's going on. I liked it. I stayed with Spawn until issue 100. So that was the one that I stayed with. But the initial thing from what I was hearing and the little bit of knowledge that I had, again, because I really didn't know how big these guys were in terms of comics, was that this was going to be, this was the second coming of Marvel Comics. You didn't want to miss out on it. And, just based on what I saw initially coming down the pike, I said, I think I can miss this. I think I'll be okay if I miss all of this. And it was like, I'm trying to remember because I'm going to believe, if I'm going to remember correctly, Spawn was usually on time. So this would be within the first, say, 5, 6 months of Image. It took about 6 months into Image for me to finally even start reading one book. So I don't know what it was like, with the other titles. But the other thing that I was also getting was that these guys were buying a ton of books. They were buying a ton of copies. And even in that stage, you have to realize that, hey, the only reason why any of these comic books uh, from Marvel from 1961 retail the way that they do is because you can't find them. These are first appearances. Marvel didn't have the best publishing deals, so they couldn't get the books out in the quantities that they wanted, distribute them in the amounts that they wanted, which they would change once they got into the 70s with the flood the zone strategy. But, you know, if Amazing Fantasy 15 was a top seller, I couldn't tell you how many copies. I couldn't tell you how many copies it sold because that again was that title got canceled. So I don't know, but it would have been a low printed issue for that time on Amazing Fantasy 15, but the sales on that particular issue would have been high enough that these guys would have been like, well, wait a second, we got something here, so we don't need to keep the book, but we do need to keep the character. That being said, in order for it to be the second coming of Marvel, it's either one or two things. It's either the money, where these guys believe, hey, these books are going to be, worth a whole bunch of money, or two, it's in terms of the ideas and the talent. Now, you did have the talent. I didn't think the ideas were quite there. And then because, I mean, I think Spawn sold something like 1.8 million copies,
Hmm.
something like that. So when you look and you have that many copies, you just Spawn's number one. You might be able to get as much as $30 for it, which is great for a book that sold that many copies. But you can't compare it to the 1961 books where they sold a fraction of that, if that. I mean, so half a fraction
Yeah.
of that at the end of the day. But that's where I was at initially, with Image. And I never fully warmed up to Image. There was never a title outside of Spawn that I could say that I had a lot of interest in. And to be quite frank, I just didn't have a lot of respect for the company with the lineup of books that they were putting out. I, I was just not interested overall. And then my lack of interest was rewarded when the market crashed and everybody was pointing the finger at Image, including me. But they just, I didn't see anything. A lot of the stuff just looked like these were Marvel characters. Okay, these were Marvel characters. These were not original characters per se. These were their takes on these type of popular Marvel characters with the with the little camouflage here and there. I never saw them as much different than that with the initial titles that came out.
Yeah. Um, for me, it was different because I was getting most of the books that they were doing beforehand, and it seemed like I was I think it was it. I'd seen Jim Lee doing Punisher Wardrobe, so they somewhere around Todd on Spider or Todd no actually Todd on Batman and Hulk. So it was like Todd on Batman and Hulk. I think Jim Lee, I saw some of his covers on Alpha Flight, so I was like, okay, I want him to see what he does on a book that I want to see, I'll read, and then because the Alpha Flight characters look kind of funky that were on the team at that point, but he did Punisher War Journal. I was like, wow, this guy is pretty good, and but then he seemed to be on the outskirts of the X-Men title. He was doing covers. He did a couple of issues. But it's like, does he like him or not? Because we need something on this. Even though X-Men was selling like crazy at that point before it got to 8 million, it's still the top book. The art was just whoever was available at that point. Marc Silvestri had kind of moved to Wolverine, and he was finding his note there. So, people look at his Wolverine as kind of the pinnacle. Mine for Marc Silvestri is more his X-Men stuff because the storytelling was just really good. And the Wolverine is a little more Mike Mignola than Silvestri to me. It's a lot more mood. And I don't know if he does that as well as Mike Mignola. But you had these guys that were big names going on, except for Jim Valentino. But Jim Valentino had already done some of the key things with Rob Liefeld on What If. He did the What If Wolverine was a shield agent. So the guy had a flair for what was going on at the time. But I was like, Jim Lee was plotting the X-Men, and so was Whilce Portacio. So it was like, oh, okay. So this guy, he's gonna become like the way George Perez and Byrne and Walter Simonson. They're gonna become writers like these guys. So it's like, oh, I'm watching these guys at the ground floor where Byrne was when Byrne and Perez or Miller talk about when they were getting their teeth kicked in by Neil Adams saying you guys are just terrible, or Marv Wolfman saying you guys are just terrible, and then they grew into these big talents. So it's like I'm at the ground floor, even with Rob Liefeld. It's like I would think I would talk with a couple people that was actually doing art regularly, and they were saying how bad he was, but I could still see some Arthur Adams in his work, and I was like, so if he starts out like Arthur Adams, Byrne is like a Neil Adams clone. What if you're an Arthur Adams clone? What will he become as he learns to draw and grows from it? Where people, of course, it'll be the pull of drawing the style that you're used to, but at the same time, what could he become as he learns stuff? So it's like I'm on the ground floor for me, it was the ground floor of the next generation of the people in the 80s that were big, or late 70s, like Perez and Byrne. Because Perez was kind of before, Walter Simonson before both of them, but it took him like almost 12 years, even though he was accomplished. He had already had, in the 70s, he had Manhunter. Early 80s, he had the graphic novel of Aliens, and then he hits it big with X-Men and X-Men Teen Titans and Thor. And they're like, oh, this new guy, Simonson, when he'd been around for 10 to 12 years in the business. So it seemed like these guys, and it seemed like they were, doing their first ventures into writing. I think Todd was writing Spider-Man, and it wasn't that good, but it was a hope that it could get better. And then Rob, I think that was to me, him writing, it felt like we took the book that was it didn't have, it was now missing something. It had the energy. It didn't have like the basics, like the kind of the interactions, but it did have action now. So it's like this book can happen with Louise Simonson when they got rid of her and they had Fabian Nicieza. Fabian Nicieza like, I'm not doing plot. I'm just keeping this book fun. I'm keeping this book fun. I'm not doing any crazy dialogue here, whereas you have Chris Claremont, fleshing out a lot of stuff in those X-Men's and X Factors, and Byrne doing the same when he was writing it for a short while. They were really trying to keep the story as energetic as the what's the name. Whereas I think Fame in the Sense was like, no, this is like Die Hard. Just keep the cool lines going, that sort of thing. So I didn't really like the New Mutants 98 to 100 or X Force, but I said there is some promise here. I'm hoping he gets to it. And then I saw X Force #1 as a Teen Titan page in there, and I was like, oh, come on. I'm not sure if it's going to make it. But before that happens, Image happened. And so I'm like, I have to be on the ground floor for this. And I was a big collector at that point. I wasn't the 3 comic collector, but I did buy multiple issues of the Image stuff, the early stuff. I don't think I bought multiple issues of Shadowhawk or what's the thing, Cyberforce. But I did check out. I think I got most of them, at least the #1s of those. So it was really like if I was still kind of collecting, but not extremely serious about it because I wasn't bagging them and boarding everything. I was bagging and boarding stuff at that period, but I would still read it. So you have to make the decision if you're going to be a collector. I'm not going to read it, or I'm going to have a copy that I don't read. And I had some, obviously, there's so many of those Spider-Mans that you could get. I got a ton of those. I got a ton of the X-Men's and a number of the X-Forces, those things. But the Image comics, less of those, just the one. So it wasn't like I bought multiple issues. And I really struggled with that first Youngblood issue because it seemed like it wasn't getting better, it was going the other way. And the same would feel for, I thought the book that was obviously going to be a hit to me was going to be Wildcats, because Wildcats was the top guy. He was already plotting the X-Men. He plotted X Factor for the last, the original was there for the last 4 issues. He plotted the X-Men with Chris Claremont and without Chris Claremont. So I was like, well, this guy seems like he might be the writer. But at the same time, I kind of wanted them to drag the writers with them. Like maybe grab Fabian Nicieza or Peter David, and they would have someone to help them flesh out their ideas. But obviously, Todd was kind of like, no, we got to go in on our own. I think Rob said that to them, like, you got to get into writing because we're wasting time letting these guys getting all that money. So it's like that. So Jim Lee was the one, and it was like, I really stuck with that one the most, and I really wanted that to hit. And I think the closest it got to when it was kind of working was when Alan Moore was writing it. Chris Claremont wrote it around issue, I think 10 or something like that. But it was, I think at some point Alan Moore kind of switched from the regular team to this makeshift team that he had that was not in space, and they were like kind of more gritty. And I was like, he doesn't even like the regular team anymore. He just likes this kind of Moorish team, which has a Superman character in it and has this cyborg that says all this nasty stuff and whatnot. It's just like, he doesn't really like the Image guys anymore. He puts so much energy into it, and then now it kind of doesn't hold up. So initially, I was all in with reservations, but it was like I had to because I already bought all these guys. And I quickly tapered off of, I think early on, because Silvestri's kind of looked a little bit too much like Jim Lee. So it's kind of like, Silvestri's a great artist. He shouldn't be doing cyborgs or doing like because it was kind of like a revamped Reavers that look like superheroes. It's like he needs to be doing something that's kind of more, we get into storytelling and quiet moments, and because he can do all that stuff where the other guys can't do that as well. So he should be doing something that's really, and maybe with a writer would help. I think Valentino's was kind of just like, for shock value, because it was a character who breaks people's backs. So he was like every issue breaking someone's back, but it had a hook that he has an issue, which was, what was it? The character had AIDS. It was the sort of thing. So it was then in going to what you were saying, Spawn. And I think it was, so I was trying to like Wildcats. I did catch on to Spawn. I think Spawn, when he had all the writers on it, I think I had Spawn #1 and maybe 2, and then I kind of drifted. I didn't buy the Overkill one, which he co-created with Rob, but I bought the ones which had the writers And I couldn't tell you the one that Frank Miller wrote. I couldn't tell you one Alan Moore wrote. I remember the one Dave Sim did, but I liked the one Neil Gaiman did. I did like that. We reviewed it. I don't think it holds up as well, but that's when I kind of started collecting Spawn, and I kind of liked when he had the publishing snafu where he was late and he brought in Grant Morrison to do two fill-in issues at the same time Alan Moore was doing the Violator. So it was like all this energy was going into Spawn. We had all these writers on the book and Spawn Batman, which wasn't that great, but it was like the book was just like big. Then when Rob Liefeld left X-Force, Greg Capullo, who was as far as his ability was better, the energy that Rob brought to the book is can't be denied. But it was like drawing wise, Greg Capullo was like way better. So I was like, oh wow, the book is that. And then he was going after, they weren't promoting him, but he's doing what looked like one of the best books, best X books. No, it was second best. Excalibur was still the better book in my opinion. But this one had the right energy. It was a lot of fun. And then he wouldn't promote him, so then Todd stole him. So he was on like the last issue of Violator. So that was the book for me. I was like, okay, this is working. I bought Savage Dragon for a little while, but I dropped off. And then I would always check out what was going on. And then there was some books later that happened. But it was all this promise that was there. All this thing of saying, what if you got to do your own characters? And, there's other people that brought forth characters post, created their own characters where you say, am I buying this for the character or the creator? And, Image kind of said you can buy for the creator, but I would still ask those questions. I still trying to ask those questions. But the initial launch is kind of sad because it was saying how much these are the characters that they wanted to do for who knows how long. And Rob did not in succession. He did 6 issues with big breaks in between and then stopped. And then I think in 94, he came back, did another 7 to, I guess it's either 6 to 10 or 7 to 10. And he changed the approach because he looked at Silvestri's work and he was like, I need to put some more energy into this. And it became one of the characters go to hell. The guy with the skull goes to hell. So it was like, but yeah, it's like there's a lot of promise to these books. A lot of feeling like these guys were going to be, they were talking like they wanted to be Kirby. They actually were bringing Kirby along with them. They did, what's that thing? Phantom Force, that Kirby did one of the projects that didn't get off the ground. He had all these Phantom Force issues that I guess was going to go to Pacific, but Pacific fell apart. He had a couple other books too. I think it was like a Hell, like some sort of characters from Hell. That got produced by someone else. But he had all these issues done, and Rob, they said, I just heard Rob had connected with, Jim Valentino connected with Kirby to do this project, which the Image guys inked. And, they were able to cut Kirby a check from the project. So that was one of the good things. And they also, in their rhetoric, they always brought up Kirby. So that's kind of how Kirby became this new big thing, because they were just like, we got screwed like Kirby. When they actually did, and they got royalties and all this other stuff. But at the same time, the byproduct is Kirby become lionized, which was a very positive thing. So in my opinion, the energy was all there. But then even when Whilce got there and he was doing his Wetworks book, it was just like, not him either. It doesn't seem like he has the energy to keep this book going. And that was the harder part for these things, where they had these books that they had to do. They had to leave X-Force. They had to leave Marvel. And even Todd, he went from drawing it to, he'd have to thanks Greg. And then Greg Capullo took it over from, I guess it's in around issue 20 something, 22 or something like that. He kind of ghosted. He would get a thanks Greg. And then Greg went over pencil and he was inking. And I was like, I'm going to be here for a while because I'm a big Greg Capullo fan. I think around issue 30, I was kind of like, I think I've read enough Spawn. Because I got Blood Feud, which was good by Alan Moore. Those are the first that you could see Alan Moore's layouts. He actually drew some images for the image guys to do, and he said maybe that'll be easier, and they would follow his layouts exactly. So it was there was a lot of energy on Spawn, but I kind of fell out on that. And I think I came back to the Savage Dragon, and I read that till, yeah, I guess when he fought something happened. I think was it when Hellboy joined. I think I was reading Hellboy a lot, and Hellboy they had a crossover, and I was with Savage Dragon from like issue 30 or something like that to 75. So that's when I stuck with. But I always check out what was in the Image wheelhouse. They had some Gen 13 is kind of ones that I was checking out. And then Jim Lee, his whole line of books, he had Homage Studios, which had some good books. He had the Cliffhanger stuff. And then when Alan Moore, because I was following his stuff, I was buying everything Alan Moore had from them. I think he went from awesome to Jim Lee's thing. So then there was a bunch of books I was buying, and then there would be creators that would do something for Image that I would check out. So, but the promise of the initial titles, that's the saddest part, because they all were like these. This is what we've been wanting to do for a while. Not Jim Valentino. He kind of developed the book to do for Image, but all like Jim Lee said, the Wild Boys is why I got into the comic books. They saw this Wild Boys and saw that energy. That's what they picked me to do comic books, and I've been always wanting to do this. And it was like issue 13, handing it over to Charis, like that sort of thing. It's like, what do you mean I'm going sabbatical? I thought this was your book. So yeah, so there's a lot of promise, a lot of but a lot of success, which lead them to try to do the stuff that was going on with the Turtles, to do movies, to do animation. Todd got into toys. It was always to do the next thing, which, I mean, we didn't know that going in, but the press release kind of said, you know, all of the positive things. We got screwed, and now we got freedom, and, you know, they did what they wanted to do. So then at the same time, to bring it back, you know, I'm guessing what it could be, but as far as Image as a company, what would you say is a signature book for you outside of Spawn? I know you said Spawn and you stayed there to 100, but is there anything else you're saying this was the
From
work?
the early days?
Huh?
From the early days?
Any day, anytime that you want. You can go to present day, that at least they did this and we got The Walking Dead. Or they did this, we got Supreme. Like any one book or any couple books, you say, you know what, even though they had some struggles, I didn't like this or that, what is the end where you say, you know what, they gave us this?
Well, I'm probably gonna say without a doubt it's Walking Dead. The early stuff I don't think it just doesn't have a lot of, like, a book like Spawn doesn't have a lot of gravitas until it hit Spawn 300.
Hmm.
And then it had longevity. So now it's like, okay, you know, it's made it to 300, you know, it's still going, looking back. But then, you know, of course, Savage Dragon is going to hit 300. I know how you feel about that book, so that might be a wash right there. But, you know, I the I guess the great irony is that when Image starts off, these are, you know, superhero comics mostly. You know, yeah, superhero comics. You may have had like the spy superhero comics, the you know, like the horror, the supernatural type stuff, but still superhero comics overall. And where we are today, now Image is actually what it was they were saying initially,
Yeah.
where you know, this is definitely so much of an indie publishing house. But Walking Dead, I think, really cemented that, because you had, I mean, there were a whole bunch of other books that were coming out, and I would read some books, you know, here and there, depending on what I read and depending on what was the solicitation, you know, cover, because they weren't really getting a lot of, at least for me, like a lot of top art. Most of those guys went over to the superhero comics for the most part, but you know, they would get what I would call like indie art, where it
Mm.
was like it's, you know, it tries its best to look as bland as possible.
Yeah.
But you know, when did I caught on, because somebody caught, turned me on to Walking Dead, hadn't heard about it, and it was already at least 2 or 3 years in. So I was like, all right, cool. So maybe more, because I think I was reading and it would might have been as far as like issue number 60. So I was reading that and I got to read it issue after issue. Because if I had read it just one issue after another in real time, I probably wouldn't have stuck around with it. But I was like, oh, okay, this is without a doubt very, very different in terms of what was being published. The audience for it, was just ape scat over it. But this was an image, I mean, that was an image title that hit from the ground running in the vein of, say, like a Superman or a Spider-Man. And it was just, it came out, people liked it, and they just continued to like it, couldn't get enough of it, started being manipulated in other forms. That was a really good book for them. Yeah, I would definitely say Walking Dead. It eventually cooled off, but and that's the other thing, because it cooled off in a manner where you can't even go back to it. I mean, it wasn't that Kirkman wasn't doing other stuff, because he was doing Walking Dead, he was doing Invincible, he was doing what was this awesome werewolf, Guardians of the Globe, and he was doing a bunch of other stuff, but it was Walking Dead that became the gateway book at that time to come into Image Comics and explore other stuff that was going on. It was just yeah, that would be the Image Comics book. I think overall, I think looking back on it, you still have the initial story of it starting up, and we both know what it, we both know what it was really about. It was like, hey, we want whatever T-shirts we make based on these characters, we want that money.
Yeah.
Okay, you made a Spider-Man T-shirt and it was my cover. I want that money. I want a cut. And the long-term strategy was never that we're never going back to Marvel or to DC. We saw that with Heroes Reborn.
Yeah.
So it was never that we're not going to work with these guys ever again. I mean, I'm pretty sure Todd McFarlane would work. I mean, he's done the DC work already, but he would work with Marvel Comics again. But I know it would be the same thing like for Jim Lee. It's got to be Jim Lee on X-Men. With Todd McFarlane, it's got to be Spider-Man. And Todd McFarlane probably is never going to do it unless there's something else attached to it, like toys, which we've discussed that, off the podcast. So, those initial days with those initial aspirations, we already know. But I think in totality of the company, yeah, Walking Dead, that's the book that most people will probably look at that either brought them to Image, or a lot of people say that's the book that put Image on the map, because their initial offerings were not very substantive. So we got the crash some years later, and that whole you can't have two companies doing Marvel, because Marvel's doing Flood the Market, and Image is like, well, we'll do Flood the Market one better, and it was just too much product, and the product wasn't good.
Yeah. For me, there's so many books that were okay, or books that kind of worked, and it seemed like they didn't understand what it means to be a success. No one, in my opinion, in my opinion, something like the X-Men, the reason why the X-Men was a success was that period. There's a period where, even though you had Burn on it, whatever, and the Dark Phoenix or that sort of thing, you had like 3 years of Burn, you had 2 years of Cockrum before that, and then you had, I guess it's like a little over a year Cockrum of this kind of thing that had a not seamless but seemingly the same sort of book. So you had like five to, I guess it's the 82. Then Paul Smith comes and you get a hot artist on there, or he wasn't. I guess you can't consider it hot because he wasn't able to take that success. But you had some like 5 year stretch, or no, I guess it's like more than that. Like it's like a 7 to 8 year stretch of this continuity of artists, right? Cockrum, Burn, Cockrum type of deal. So I don't think that I don't think that so I don't think that this portion of it, of what Image understood of what a success is. A success is having a book. That's why Superman was a success, that you had a consistent team early on, and when it kept getting bigger, they were consistent. And when they shifted it, it was a consistent team with Wayne Boring on it. And so even though they had different artists, they had that kind of lead artist. then Kurt Swan, and that for a good 20 years of success. Or whereas I said like 7 to 8 years of X-Men. The Image guys we have a hit book like Gen 13 and it not go anywhere after that. So it's kind of like they wouldn't keep the people there for a decent amount of time. Like 3 years is a good time to keep an artist on a book that's new that would kind of keep the sales going if you had success the entire time. And I don't think they had so many books that were, I'd go Gen 13 or Danger Unlimited by the same artist that were books that showed the promise of what Image was, of style over substance, but they were fun books. Not saying that they were rewriting history or making anything better than anything we've seen before, but it was what Image was. They were.
Because they definitely were not.
Yeah, but it's like this is what Image. This is the books that they're like. They're not gonna do what Starlin or Mignola are gonna do with their sort of characters. They're gonna do a more lighter fare that you can come in and read a comic book less than what you would do when you were a kid reading the Marvel in the '80s. But those was promises.
No, it was like a straight up cash grab. But this is for for the creators. They knew like, hey, how many books did we sell? We sold 1.8 million copies. We know there's not 1.8 million readers of this book out there. There's like probably at any given time. Let's say at any given time there's like 2 million comic book readers. Okay, we know everybody didn't buy a copy of this book. We know one guy bought 5, 6 copies of this book, and he's putting it away to try to make some money. But we're gonna make our money, and then we're gonna buy all the art. Okay, we're gonna buy up all these Golden Age collections, and we're gonna buy all this original art, X-Men, of course. And when they knew the buy was gonna drop out. They could tell like 6 to 8 months. This is worse than insider trading. What did they also do? What was the other practice they had? They would look. And like, let's look at the numbers on this book. Is the book selling? I'll forget that one. We'll go over here. So it was no surprise at the end of the day when this stuff happened. They weren't trying to make, what was that line? We're making roses here. No, you're not. You're making money. That's what the whole deal was.
Anyone can issue out a monthly comic book. We're growing roses. That was Todd's line.
But that again is where these guys were at when Image started. Image was not about creative freedom. Image was about, you guys are manipulating the art that I drew, and I'm not getting a cut of it. These guys are you're selling the original art that I don't own for how much money? Now forget that. I'm going to go over here with my own characters, which is still pervasive amongst creators today, where we create these characters. Now, I'm not creating anything for you. I'm going to save it for my own independent work, and that way I'll get 100% of the money. What do you mean I don't get any royalties for these characters when they go to the Marvel movies? What do you mean that's not an original character? So you still have that attitude that is very pervasive amongst creators. But again, this is, I think you touched on it with Superman, but more so than just being a hit and something you could keep on, Superman was a book that you could build a universe around, where you could introduce some more characters. And, for whatever reason, people did not get tired of Superman. They liked him. The people, it wasn't just the kids came in, liked Superman, and that was it. New kids came in and liked Superman. And then the people, as they got older, they still looked fondly upon this character. They may not read the comics, but they may not mind listening to the radio program or going to see the movie or the TV show. And that's something you can build. That's something, because you have that as your cornerstone, you can build a universe around. With Spider-Man, same thing. Hot out the gate. And this is different because you have the Fantastic Four, which was, very good seller for Marvel. And what came right after? What was right after Fantastic Four? Was it the Hulk?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe not. So was it Fantastic Four, Hulk, and then Thor?
Thor, yeah.
Yeah, definitely not. Well, the Hulk came out. 6 issues got canceled, but we all know that the character was still popular with readers. People didn't, they weren't necessarily buying the book, but they didn't have a problem with that character. He eventually would get back into a book within relative quickness. But you get Spider-Man, and it's the same thing. Spider-Man hits, people love that character. They love that character. They never stop loving the character, and then new people come in they love the character this, and they love the character the same way. He took off from the start, never looked back. You know, those type of, and those are, you have to really think about it. Those are one-offs in big companies like Marvel and DC. DC has never had another Superman. Okay, they created characters, you know, like Batman afterwards, but Batman was not Superman. You know, he wasn't. Batman took a long time to find some, for decades, and he was able to do that because you had Superman. So you could produce you could produce Batman comics, you know, for X amount, X amount of decades, and he was, you know, able to get that footing. And then you go to Marvel, what the probably the next thing that you would say is X-Men, but X-Men was like what, a decade, maybe 15 years before they would find that particular footing. So, and they were able to do that. Why? Pretty much based on the strength of a character like Spider-Man, who's your flagship character, who can keep everything going and allows you to test, create, you know, and and shields other characters from cancellation. I mean, X-Men wasn't so much canceled as they, just, they weren't into reprints at the end of the day, but they you never had another Spider-Man. Like, this guy's just hot out of the gate, right out of, at least to the best of my, yeah, never again. All the other characters, especially the guys who were popular in the 90s, that was a maturation process of, in some cases, like close to 20 years. Wolverine, Punisher, these guys took time to catch on. So when you have that, it's great. I don't think Image ever understood that. I think Image was, hey, we're selling, we're making money, look at these numbers, this is pretty good. But where it's also different because, these are different uh, publishing houses all under one umbrella, if you will. But where was that initial character that comes out of the gate that makes you want to delve into the world of Image? It's not a very connected world, to say the least. But where was that character or that book that really made you want to come in and start scooping up other stuff image wise? Kirkman, I thought, was really trying to do that with the books that he was putting out. But that again is under his own, that's under his own umbrella with the Skybound universe. So that was the thing I thought Image never really had it. And I don't know if they realized, hey, this is something that would definitely help overall, because if we have this gateway character, this guy will come in and hopefully attract people to other books that are in the Image, that are, being produced by Image, even if they're being produced by a different creator.
Well, I mean, you think you went on the point I was making and say, in using the other part of what you were saying about Kirkman, say you had a writer and you put in the appropriate amount of time, which would be 3 years on the book. You should do more than that, but that's usually to say, what I think Byrne got to 28 on Alpha Flight. And Alpha Flight was alive to at least 150. It had a resurgence towards issue 100, and they kept pulling whoever got hot on it to other books. Oh, Scott Lobdell, let's take you to the X-Men now. Tom Morgan, who created the U.S. Agent, let's put you on Punisher 2099. So we don't know if it could have keep going, but the thing is, at least putting that time in there. And I don't think the guys at the time, even who was it? But you also have a sign of the hot book, right? Because you had New Mutants, they changed artists in the first year, and it lasted because you kept changing. But Punisher, they had another hot character because they could change artists as they were going on. But then when the crash happens, then you say, well, why doesn't the Punisher have legs anymore? And you can put anybody on it, but it's like, no, it's put in that time in, and the Image guys are working on the same Marvel model. It's just like, hey, let's start it. We got a success. Now we put someone else on it, like the way Superman. No. Like with Byrne, like, no, he was on the book for like a long time. They're on a book for a decent amount of time. And the thing is, they was, with the fact of the Dark Phoenix saga being held and the shooter asked for changes, that last year of the book, the last year of the Burns on the book, they're behind because of that. The lettering was done on overlay on the last few issues because they're trying to catch up to where they were. So it's like that sort of thing of what it is, the struggle of schedule. But they were kind of like, no, we said we did the character, and now we get other people to do it like Marvel. It's like, no, You have 36 issues of Amazing Spider-Man, and then you got John Romita being connected to the title well past 100. So that's like 70 or even more issues where John Romita is connected to either the insides, inking, or covers. So you have this Jack Kirby on the Fantastic Four for 100 issues. So like in Marvel, or even John Buscema and Conan for like forever. So it's like that sort of thing is what you have for success, and it's kind of like they were looking at it like, yeah, you move from title to title, and even when it became a writer's thing, you have Mark Miller talking about you do like Watchmen, you do 12 issues and then you go and it worked for him, but he was doing kind of a Morrison and more light and a little more action to it, and picking artists that kind of go to the guts, and it was successful for him. But that's not the true comic book success. Robert Kirkman at least brought us back to where it was, where people see a book, there's word of mouth, people read it, they stay on, and then he gets to decide that he wants to cancel his book. He wants to end his book. He wants to maybe do some other books like it, but he gets to make the decision that, all right, somewhere after 100, I'm deciding to end it, where Todd was like, no, you should keep it going. Because Todd, he ultimately wanted something like Batman, which would keep going, but he didn't want to be there doing the work all the time. But he wanted to have the Romita effect of inking it and trying to get some other things. So to go into this, and ultimately I'd say the long-lasting thing would be, I'm looking at that Todd moving into toys, because the long-standing thing was that's the thing you can see. Him going into toys and bringing his approach and adding a ton of detail. And all these guys are about adding detail, whether it be pouches or whatever you want to say, weapons and all that. Him adding that to the toys kind of said, all of these people, you have to up your game on your toys. So we see people, when we see figurines and all that other stuff, the game has all been up. So there's many other things that they've done, getting, Alan Moore, probably wouldn't have wanted to have to go to DC, but he got to do, make a lot of money at Image. So that's another positive. And he was doing superhero comic books. Again, not the best stuff of his work, but, it's bringing some little more energy to these Image stuff. So those are the couple things I could say. I always bring up J. Scott Campbell, even though the promise of someone like that, kind of ended because he only did short runs on these classic books that he did, or entered not classic but more hot books that he was doing, new hotness, and then didn't stick with it. So there's so many books that I bought. I mean, you see my collection. You've seen some Image books in my collection. So it was something that I always had the feel and wanted the promise of it, and then the books everyone's leaving for something else, or going back to Marvel and that sort of thing. So it's a tough period. It's a tough period. There's so many books that didn't make it through the 90s, that didn't make it while books were hot, by some of my favorite creators. So I couldn't, there's 2 issues of George Perez book that didn't make it. So there's so many things that didn't make it. And so just kind of looking at the periphery, I'd have to say the toys. So, but it was funny because when you went to the last things that you were saying and the cash grab part of it, Rob will say, I didn't want it to be a wholly negative thing. And I'm pretty sure since we have a, percentage of when people drop off, I'm pretty sure that you're not there this time. Rob talks about not getting into comic books for the money. And he's right. He didn't. He got into comic books to draw comics. And he got on Hawk and Dove. And he got to the X Office. And he did some fill-ins. And I'm pretty sure after he got those royalty checks, because he also says when he was at what's the name? He was at a con, and he was like saying to the kids, he was like, you know why I want to do this? Because Marc Silvestri has a house right on the beach, and no one had a reaction. And he's like, right on the beach. That's about the money. So yep. I understand that, initially they wanted to do their best job. They wanted to work on cool characters. They wanted to be a success. Once you see the money, it's hard not to see the money, you know. Now, I think if he decided to do Alpha Flight, he probably would have had the same sort of success. But he likes the idea of having the X, so he took the New Mutants. I mean, he says he didn't want to do X Factor because of Walter Simonson. I I can't compare. He doesn't compare artistically to Walter Simonson. He could have totally followed Walter Simonson on it. He did an issue. He did an issue like a. It was like a. He did a fill-in of it, so I had already seen him do it, and I seen him coming around. So it wasn't like to it. So he could have followed him, and Whilce Portacio followed him. John Bogdanov, he followed him too. So like these are X books. At that point, X Factor was a book that was selling. You know, New Mutants wasn't selling as much, and he made it into a top 10 book. You know, I don't think he was totally failing, but there was money involved in what was going on in those books. And once you see the money, it's hard not to see the money. So while you got into comic books, yes, you know, but at the same time, we have people who was like, you know, was Marc Silvestri going to do Namor? Because at one point they was, you know, they were saying he's going to do Namor, but he's like, no, I'm not going to do Namor. I'm going to do Wolverine. You know, and the thing of where you had people like Byrne and Miller and George Perez, where they're taking on titles Titans had not sold before, and he said, since I created, let me stick with it. The X-Men was almost canceled. Byrne didn't know that. Byrne just wanted to do the X-Men. He thought this was like the hottest title he could do. He loved it so much. He didn't know that it was, you know, he knew the sales when he was on it that they were struggling, but he didn't know that it might get canceled before he got there. So, and Miller was on the Daredevil, which was another book that was struggling, and he put that. So it was a period where you could do a dud, and then when they got to there, they were like, oh, the reason why Byrne is doing She-Hulk because they won't let him on any books. It's like that's a money thinking way of things where, you know, in the 80s people would turn down the X-Men. Brent Anderson turned down the X-Men, Bob McLeod, Bill Sienkiewicz, Alan Davis, like a ton of people with knowing what the royalties. Paul Smith left. And when they asked him to come back, he said no until he said, oh, there's a motorcycle. Let me do X-Men Alpha Flight. So there's a period in the 80s. Byrne was being asked to do the X-Men in the 80s the entire time. And he said no to X-Men Teen Titans. There was so many people saying no to the X-Men. And I don't fault him for looking at the X-Men and saying, I don't want to do New Mutants. I want to be called X-Force. Getting money, because that's what you're supposed to do. But saying, you know, that it wasn't about money at some point, come on. You want to find out what your success is afterwards. Can I bring the successor characters I own by myself, not just the 4%? Smart move. This is a smart move. So that's my last bit. So I did want to say something to say when you brought up the, you know, the cash grab part, which I don't disagree with the part. Once the money's there, once they see the money's there, they're okay with not doing Marvel stuff, you know. So,
What was it?
hmm?
Uh, hmm, like spazzing on names at the end of the day. It's one of the creators, and he says he was expecting to make like, you sell, 300, you sell one book at $3. If you make like 100,000, which he thought would be a number he could make coming out the gate, $300,000. Now that's a totally different thing when you sell over 1 million copies. You're like, well, wait a second, and then it keeps happening at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Was it Rob? That was Rob Liefeld. That was his estimate that he figured that he could come 300,000 out the gate, but he would all of that money because he had already you already put up the initial cost, which is not 300,000.
Yeah.
By any stretch of the imagination. He was doing the art. He probably saving a whole bunch. He was doing the art. He was doing the writing. You could probably phone in the coloring and the inking if that. And so he was going to get the lion's share of all of that money, all the production costs. And then, of course, you do the trade paperback, you sell that, you're going to get 100% of that because it's just printing costs and that's going to be dirt cheap for you. But when it comes back in, you've quadrupled whatever your estimate was. That changes things. I
Yeah.
mean, literally, you're talking millionaires overnight.
You also have to. You have to imagine that you had at the time you had Miller doing a couple of books, and he was like, in his mind, Miller's like, I got my tail between my legs. I'm just gonna do Sin City as a something I've been wanting to do, a black and white book in Dark Horse Presents. Not to, and then slowly started to overextend himself in Dark Horse Presents. He was like, I'm just gonna try to just do a little thing, get back in arc after what's that thing, RoboCop. And he had Martha Washington. I think Byrne doing Next Men. I think the first issue was like something over 200 thousand for the first issue, because it was that's through reorders though. So it's like there was initial order, but those were like, hey, these are really great numbers. This is the biggest numbers we've seen. And then no one. Then when Youngblood started out, they said the same numbers initially, and then went to a million. It's like they forgot. The next one initially was doing well for an independent book, and I'm just that's only the reason why I could guess they got their numbers. So they were like, oh, 300,000 or 500,000 be okay, and they're like, Rob did what? Whatever it was, a million or 700, 800,000. Well, I'm gonna totally kick his behind. But that's how competitive they were. So yes, I mean the problem is that, and that's the thing I think Bernard also talked about when he worked with Jim Lee. He said invariably, they were, you know, being success, become an image and being a success and not doing the work, which invariably happens to everyone. When you get that initial success and they're casting you to come everywhere else, and you're doing these great talks about everything you want to do, you're not going to be sitting at the book. And then at the same time, you see, Eastman and Laird, and they're moguls now, and they're like, I'm a mogul. What am I doing comic books for? I need to get an artist to take over my books. So here.
Oh, you're not a mogul. Well, look at Eastman and Laird again. This is, it didn't happen for Mirage, but Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is hot out the gate.
Yes.
And these guys they're very much household names. A lot of people grew up watching the cartoon. They've seen the films. They've had a lot of longevity for a black and white series that was pretty much a spoof, or something that was just taking the piss out of Marvel Comics' love of ninjas and mutants at that particular time. Image, uh, as much respect as I have for Todd McFarlane, I think he's a good businessman. He's a hard worker. He's diligent when it comes to the stuff that he puts out, and his toy line is just awesome.
Yep.
Okay, more so than anything else he's done with them is that toy line, just awesome. The stuff that he was making even back in the early days, the not statues, but like almost like action statues, if you will. All those things great, but even though Spawn has hit 300 issues, Spawn is not a household name. Most people don't know who this character is.
Yes. Yes.
And that is, again, that's the big, that is the big difference. Spawn has had an animated show. Spawn has had a film. So it's not like he hasn't gone into those particular avenues, but there's most people have no idea who Spawn is. There has never been an Invincible film, but most people have an idea, but a whole bunch of people know who that character is based on the Netflix, based on the not the Netflix, the Amazon Prime animated series. Big difference. And then you would have to ask, well, look, why don't you do that for Spawn? You got 300 issues. You could probably get 5 or 6 seasons easily, out of the whole thing. But I don't think the drive to manipulate that character in that particular manner is there. And where Invincible is a storyline that had an ending, meaning, look, this was not something I'm looking to do in perpetuity. Eventually, there's going to be a last story. It's been plotted there. This is where it's going to go at the end of the day. Same thing for Walking Dead. I look at stuff like Spawn and Savage Dragon, and these are series that are going to go as long as the creator wants it to go on. The second that he's like, you know what, I just don't want to do this anymore, I don't see somebody else stepping into it, and this they're still going forward. And that is probably one of the big issues that I have with Image. It's you, the stuff is there, but it's kind of just there.
Yeah, I mean that's there's no truer statement, and every time you see, I think the harder part is right before Jim Lee left, he was putting his, it seemed like, all right, so this is going to be a more focused book. Max Faraday going to be like almost like a video game adventure comic book, like with regular dudes and this otherworldly like stuff that you see like in a video game. And as soon as the numbers weren't right, we're out. We're pulling this book. That sort of thing. So it's kind of that's the thing that's kind of sad to say. And you're supposed to. You're supposed to pull a book that is not selling, but it's like um I don't know if it wasn't selling. It wasn't doing the image. That's the thing I think the 1963 guys were talking about, saying that hey, these books are selling in the half a mil. The last issue is selling like 150,000. It's like, but it's a half a mil on the first issue, which is a good cushion for the rest of the book. And the image guys is just not selling enough. They're like, let's just have Alan Moore do our stuff. So yeah, I can definitely agree with what you're saying, and but the promise, the idea that they were trying to come up with their characters that were going to be the next stage, and the only thing I can liken it to is, you know, like Burns' approach, his feeling on the Alpha Flight, that these were kind of his fan characters, and they didn't have, in his mind, the gravitas that to keep going. He was, like he did everything he wanted to do with the characters, but at the same time, he created them when he was a fan. So if he created them when Jim Shooter was asking him to do a book, he would come up with like completely different characters. That's why I think the characters that came on later, like Marina and Puck, they had more of a kind of what he wanted to. But the difference is that the fans were really hooked into the Alpha Flight. So they, even though Byrne was looking like, well, James McDonald Hudson is not much to his character, and the fans are like, this is the guy. And it's like, even though they said to him they didn't want a group book, they'd buy another group book. That's what they wanted. So it's like, but at the same time, having something where you don't have a lot of weight to it, and you hadn't put to the as much weight as Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had put into the Fantastic Four, whereas there's more weight in the in Reed Richards to Mr. Fantastic than say Spawn to Al Simmons, where there was always something to draw on with Thing and that sort of thing. So it's like having a writer, and that's what the thing is, having a writer being able to say, what's the backstory to this? And that's the thing where I kind of got hooked into Hellboy, where I like the look, but Mike Mignola had a lot of backstory to it. Had like a hook of this hell creature from hell that gets raised by this army, and he has all this backdrop of all these other characters that is connected to them. When they see him, they're like, "What are you doing? Like you're supposed to bring the forth Ragnarok and all this other stuff." And he's like, "Sorry, I'm not the guy." And it's a hook that worked, and still, he was able to move this on. But just having a writer, and Neil isn't initially a writer, but he basically had worked the same way that Neil Gaiman did. He just had a lot of action and stuff, but he's drawing from the same books. So as a thing, it's hard to always look at it and say, writers of Alan Moore is drawing from his favorite stuff, So it's like having a writer to kind of give you enough backstory to kind of say, well, we need another hook. Even the same thing that who's that? Jim Valentino. And I'm going to end here. Jim Valentino saying to Robert Kirkman, saying, "What is the hook of this zombie book?" Because it wasn't called Walking Dead. It was Night of the Living Dead. There was some zombies in space or something like that. And then he came with The Walking Dead. He said, "Well, I like the title. Let's do that title." And he said, "Well, if you would have told me it was about the people, it was about a father and son dealing with this extreme situation, I would have bought it immediately. That's why I turned about it, and that's what I think he said. Who's it? Erik Larsen and Eric Stevenson said to him, "No, the hook means give him something that he can sell." And then when he had The Walking Dead, he's all right, that's a good name. Let's just do 5 issues. So having the writers, I think the mistake was not dragging the writers with him. Maybe trying to talk to the writers and say 75-25 creation, but they were hard on doing residuals, so it wouldn't have worked out either. But in my mind, that's what I think would have been helpful. Drag the writers along, or Claremont, hey Claremont, you get 25. It would have worked out. We get rid of Silver Rain Sevens, Jim Lee and what's name doing Wildcats with characters they created. Give Chris Claremont 25%, and then see what happens. But anyway, any last words before we get out? Thank you for doing this, but any last words?
Yeah, I think we said it all.
All right. Spinner Rack is
We're
out.
out.
Thank you guys. Later. Bye.